Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. The Israeli army has announced a daily tactical pause in its military operation in parts of Gaza, including Al-Mawasi and Deir, el-Balah and Gaza City, to allow for humanitarian aid, according to an IDF statement on Telegram, and the pause will continue until further notice. Meanwhile, Israeli troops have boarded the Gaza-bound activist boat Handala as it approached the coast. According to multiple media reports, the Freedom Flotilla coalition has accused Israel of abducting the crew. Meanwhile, Hamas condemned the seizure as an act of piracy and called for international intervention. The incident heightens tensions over aid access to Gaza. A high-level U.S. business delegation led by FedEx CEO Rajesh Subramaniam will visit China this week to meet senior officials. According to reports, this delegation includes executives from Boeing and U.S.-China Business Council President Sean Stein, with a focus on reviving business talks amid tense trade negotiations. Meanwhile, the U.S. President Donald Trump is set to meet European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen today amid his 4-day visit to the United Kingdom. She meets him with the hope to clinch a last-minute trade deal. Meanwhile, Trump has voiced 50-50 chance over the success of sealing a deal. Thailand and Cambodia continue exchanging artillery fire across their disputed border, despite a ceasefire call facilitated by the U.S. President Donald Trump. The death toll has risen to over 30, mostly civilians, marking the worst violence between the two in over a decade. A Sudanese coalition led by the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has announced the formation of a parallel government amid the ongoing civil war. According to coalition spokesperson Mahmoud Hassan al-Taishi has been appointed as a prime minister, while RSF commander Mohammad Hamdan Dagalo will head the newly formed presidential council. Greece is battling destructive wildfires for a second straight day, with blazes forcing evacuations and destroying homes. Czech and Italian firefighters have now joined efforts on the ground as part of the European Union assistance to contain the infernos. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, has been working day and night for weeks on Gaza ceasefire negotiations. Rubio also said that he was confident that there could be a ceasefire agreement any day now, wherein at least half the hostages would be released, including the deceased ones, and that at the end of the day, 60-day period, the remaining hostages would be released. Rubio further added that there was a very simple solution to what was happening in Gaza. He called upon Hamas to release all hostages and lay down their arms. Rubio's comments come days after Witkoff said that U.S. was cutting short its involvement in the negotiations, claiming that Hamas had shown a lack of desire to reach a ceasefire. Now we are joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst, joins us live from Taipei, Taiwan. Thank you, Ross, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has expressed confidence, but given the stalemate negotiations, how realistic is Rubio's optimism? Also, Secretary Rubio has called for a simple solution. How practical or oversimplifies is this view according to you?
Most likely, Secretary of State Rubio said this based on his knowledge of the status of negotiations. So we'd have to assume that there's some truth to what Rubio said. The challenge there is the stakeholders, including the interlocutors between Israel and Hamas, have been working on this for quite an extended period of time, many weeks already. At other times, it seemed like they were close to reaching a ceasefire agreement, and yet they never reach it, in large part because the negotiating positions of Hamas and Israel, as far as we know, have been very far apart. Hamas wants a commitment from Israel that the war will end and Hamas can remain. Israel's position is that Hamas needs to lay down its weapons and to leave Gaza forever. So that makes it very difficult to have any kind of long-term ceasefire agreement. At best, there could be a short-term ceasefire agreement, but we've been there before with short-term ceasefire agreements. We know that they didn't last permanently.
Yes, and Ross, now what role does Hamas's stance on these negotiations play in this equation?
Well, Hamas having this absolutist position that it needs to remain and it needs in Gaza and keep its weapons, it makes negotiations extraordinarily difficult. Frankly, I don't think Hamas has any international support for its negotiating position. As angry as members of the international community increasingly are with Israel and the handling of civilian aid, and specifically all the recent attention on the growing malnutrition and starvation among civilians in Gaza. But nobody is rooting for Hamas to remain in Gaza and continue to rule after the war ends and to continue to be an armed group. There really is no international support. The problem is it's hard to put pressure on Hamas because at this point they basically kind of look at this as, we have nothing to lose. We have nothing to lose by continue fighting, and we have nothing to lose by continuing to stick to our negotiating position. So that, again, that makes the negotiations extraordinarily difficult.
And now looking back at the comments from Steve Witkoff about cutting short U.S. involvement due to Hamas's lack of desire for a ceasefire, what does this shift in U.S. strategy tell us about the limits of American diplomatic leverage in this conflict?
I'd be cautious about reading too much into what Witkoff said in that regard, or the exit from talks or the return to the United States of U.S. negotiators, because again, we've been there before where it seemed like things were close. There was active participation of Qatar, United States, and Egypt as intermediaries, and then talks seem to fall apart. The intermediaries go home, and then the talks begin again. So this might have just been some kind of a negotiating tactic by Witkoff when he said that and when the U.S. team departed. And again, based on Rubio's recent statements, it seems that the intermediaries are back at work and that there is once again possibility for a ceasefire.
So can the U.S. still be an effective mediator still? And are the complexities of this situation beyond this influence of foreign negotiations at this point?
The involvement of the intermediaries, Qatar, the United States, and Egypt, it has worked before. It has produced ceasefires. So it does appear that there seems to be a role. And also the two warring sides, Israel and Hamas, they generally have welcomed the participation of the intermediaries, including the United States. So I definitely think there's still a role to play here. If necessary, obviously the United States has the ability to put pressure on Israel. Israel has not been responsive at all times to the positions of the Trump administration, but generally Israel is responsive to United States pressure. So certainly there's still a significant role in these ceasefire talks for the United States.
Yes, thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for joining us today and sharing your expertise as a political analyst. Now we move on to our next news. Russia says it prefers a political and diplomatic solution to the conflict in Ukraine, but claims its efforts have been rejected by both Kyiv and Western nations. According to Russian media citing Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, Peskov also claimed that Moscow continues its military operation in Ukraine because all proposals for dialogue were rejected, both by Ukraine and by Western countries. This comes as Russian media reports that Russia claimed on Saturday that its forces had captured 2 more villages in eastern Ukraine, while Ukraine on the same day reported repelling multiple Russian offensives. Meanwhile, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has said that he would like to achieve the settlement for Ukraine and the lasting peace in the Middle East before the end of the term of Donald Trump in the presidential office. Now we're joined by Gilbert Doctorow. He's a Russian affairs expert, joins us live from Brussels. Thank you, Gilbert, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, from your point of view, how credible is Russia's position on speaking as diplomatic solution, and is there any evidence that exists to support or challenge their claims?
Well, the Russians certainly would like a diplomatic solution. They don't want the war to go on endlessly. If they have to conquer all of Ukraine and get to the Polish border, they still would face an insurrection, which could go on forever. So yes, they want a diplomatic solution. They want a diplomatic solution on their terms, which they've stated repeatedly, meaning the demilitarization of Ukraine, its neutrality status, the absence of any foreign troops or installations. Well, these terms are well known. The fact is that both sides, the Ukrainians and the Russians, are each pressing for a conclusion of talks that amounts to the capitulation of the other side. They are very far apart, and for that reason, each is making a claim, as Russia is doing with Mr. Peskov, that the other side is not negotiating in good faith and does not intend to find a diplomatic solution. The Russians right now are making military gains. Most importantly, they are some of their troops have entered the strategic hub, the logistics center of Pakrovsk, which is known in Russian as Krasnoyarsk. That is of decisive importance for their eventual full control of the Donbass. However, it's not an end to the war, and therefore they indeed are saying that they want a diplomatic solution.
And now, how does the involvement of external mediators like the US, Turkey complicate or potentially accelerate the peace process?
I'm glad you mentioned Turkey as an external player here, because now they are portrayed as the broker, as the hosts to the negotiations in Istanbul, and that would sound as if they're neutral. Well, they certainly are not neutral. Turkey has very important economic ties to Russia, but it also has, let's call them ideological or historical interests in parts of Ukraine, in particular in Crimea. And the relationship between Erdogan and the head of the Ukrainian negotiating team, Mr. Umerov, has to be brought out. Umerov is a Crimean Tatar, and it is not accidentally that the Ukrainian negotiating team on its way to Istanbul stopped in Ankara to speak to Erdogan. But the intervention of Western powers is maybe something that we don't see, but should see. I have in mind the ongoing disturbances in Kiev and around the country, where more than 10,000 people came out and demonstrated over the issue of a new law that strips of its independence the two agencies involved in fighting corruption. That these demonstrations took place is only possible if we understand the intervention of a major external power. And I would suggest that power is the United States. How it is that there were no such demonstrations for the last 3 years, because if you demonstrated, you get your skull cracked if you were lucky, or you'd be killed if you were less lucky. There were no demonstrations. And suddenly, in the last 10 days, there have been repeated demonstrations of very important size and, I'd say, belligerency towards the Zelensky regime. So I think that the United States, or another power, but most likely the United States, is behind the scenes preparing for the exit of Mr. Zelensky.
And now, what does this military tug-of-war signal about the current balance of power on the ground, with Russia claiming its advances and Ukraine claiming its defenses?
Well, it's hard for an outsider to make much sense of these military claims by each side. In point of fact, the Russians have advanced, made very big advances in June, the biggest advances in conquering territory in the Donbass since the start of the war. But let's put it in perspective. The 550 square kilometers that the Russians took in June is approximately the same size as the part of Kursk Oblast in the Russian Federation, which the Ukrainians seized in August of 2024 and occupied until January of 2025. So these gains are still in territory by the Russians, are still relatively small. What has been big has been the kill ratio. The Russians have vastly outperformed the Ukrainian armies in neutralizing troops on the other side. By that I mean killing and maiming soldiers to the point where they withdraw from the fight. So in this sense, the Russian war is a war of attrition against the soldiery of the other side, not a war of capturing territory.
Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insight as Russian affairs expert. That was Gilbert Doctorow with us. Now we move on to our next news. At least 11 people were injured in a stabbing incident at a Walmart supermarket in Traverse City, Michigan. According to reports, one suspect, a Michigan resident reportedly armed with a folding knife, was taken into custody. The Grand Traverse County Sheriff's Office is now investigating the attack. The Sheriff's Office said that the attack appeared to be a random act of violence. Reports suggest that the Munson Medical Center treated 11 victims, with 3 undergoing surgery, and noted an unusually high volume of emergency patients. FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino has said that federal agents are assisting local authorities as needed. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer also expressed her condolences and support, saying she was in contact with law enforcement about the horrible news and extended her thoughts to the victims and the community affected by this attack. Now we're joined by Thomas Porteous. He's my colleague and anchor and correspondent at NewsX World. Thomas, what more can you tell us about this situation unfolding?
As you've said, this does appear to be a random attack, not coordinated at all. A 42-year-old man from the state of Michigan, where the attack in the Walmart occurred, has been arrested. As you said, 11 people stabbed, 5 of which are now in critical condition. There has been no fatalities as of yet. We hope it does stay that way. The weapon used was a folding style knife, and the man came into the Walmart and attacked at random, seemingly. The attack lasted around 2 minutes, as we've got from the logs here. All 11 victims that were stabbed were traveled directly. They were taken directly to the Monsoon Hospital in the state of Michigan, where they are being treated. As I said, 5 to 6 of those are in critical condition, unfortunately. As you've said, this has garnered some response from officials across the United States, one being FBI Director Dan Bongino, who has said he is going to offer any necessary support to the victims involved. But once again, this seems to be a random attack. It was done by a Michigan man, a man from the state, and that's what I want to reiterate there. However, we will continue to bring you more news on how this situation develops, but a very, very tragic attack in the US state of Michigan today.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Now we move on to our next news. An update from South Korean investigators reveals new details about the deadly Juju Air crash. The crash occurred in December 2024 after a bird strike forced the pilots to make an emergency landing, resulting in a fatal fireball after the plane overshot the runway. Despite the bird strike, the Boeing 737-800's right engine was still functioning when the plane belly landed at Muan Airport. Investigators confirmed that the engine was generating enough power for flight, even though it emitted flames and black smoke. The left engine was shut down 19 seconds after the strike. The plane overshot the runway, crashed into an embankment, and erupted in flames, killing 179 of the 181 people on board. The investigation is still ongoing, and experts warn against drawing conclusions too early. Now we're joined by Vandana Singh. She's an aviation expert. Thank you very much, Vandana, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, the plane barely landed, leading to a fatal fireball. So, what are the key challenges in preventing fires after an emergency landing? And could the design of this Boeing, particularly 737-800, have anything to do with the severity of the post-crash fire?
Firstly, thank you for having me on your show. It's an honor. And as you also mentioned, and as everybody at the news is mentioning, this is still the investigation that's going on. This is not the final report. The final report is expected somewhere in 2026, which is next year. Therefore, first of all, coming to conclusions as to why this happened, I think this needs to be left to the investigating authorities. But like you rightfully said, a lot of questions need to be answered. First and foremost, that this was a wildlife habitat area. Was something being done for wildlife placement, for habitat placement? Was there some perimeter fencing? That the migratory birds, the bipinteals, they were coming across, flying. This warning came just 2 minutes before the aircraft was, landing. So what was the role of the air control tower, ATC control? What would they do? So just 2 minutes before, they are warned that there's a flock of birds coming, and it gets engulfed in both the engines. Just imagine, it causes the engine failure. Of course, the preliminary report is saying that one engine was partially working, one was not working. But the fact is, it led to a hydraulic failure. It is clear the landing gears could not come down. Aircraft made a belly landing. When belly landing happened, you had a concrete structure at the end of the runway, the localizer or the antenna that we call it. Why was it concrete? Usually this is tangible, collapsible, frangible, whatever we call it. And it is as per the International Civil Aviation Organization guidelines. Why was it not followed? So there are lots of questions here which need to be answered, including the fuel dumping mechanism of the Boeing 737 and its capabilities of fuel dumping. But did the pilots have enough time? I don't think so. Did they do their best? I do believe they did their best. They made a belly landing. The landing gear never opened. They did their best. But then what was that concrete structure doing there? The localizer, the antenna. And this is what brings to my mind that is the major cause that impact happened. Because of that impact, 179 lives perished and only 2 crew sitting right at the rear, at the back, survived. But if that was collapsible, this kind of accident would have been avoided by those pilots. Over to you, ma'am.
And Vandana, now despite the right engine's functionality, the left engine was shut down 19 seconds after the bird strike. So could you explain the standard protocols for engine shutdowns after a bird strike?
Absolutely. It is first the pilot and the co-pilot who take a call. They check, they get the warnings, and then they decide what has to be shut, what has to be kept open. But looking at the situation, it seems that the birds were totally engulfed in both the engines. Now, which one was severely damaged, which one was less damaged, what the pilots did, I think the pilots did something very, very brave by attempting the belly landing in the first place. Otherwise, it would not have been possible. But the structure, the localizer, the antenna is what that caused the maximum damage. And when there is something like this, a proper SOP is followed, and the captain takes a call as to what has to be done. Let's not forget there wasn't much time. Now you're looking at a warning which is just 2 minutes before, which is 120 seconds before the strike. The flock of birds entered, the migratory birds entered the engine of they were engulfed. So how much time did they really have to follow the rule book A, B, C, D? They did the best that they could at that time also.
Thank you.
And they braved it up.
Great. Thank you very much, Vandana Singh, for always joining us and sharing your expertise as an aviation expert. Now we move on to our next news. Passengers on board an American Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 were evacuated at Denver International Airport after the aircraft aborted takeoff due to a landing gear incident that sparked a fire and a silent smoke billowing from the jet. The plane, operating as Flight 3023 to Miami, was carrying 173 passengers and 6 crew members when the mechanical issue unfolded. According to the Federal Aviation Administration, the aircraft reported a possible landing gear failure during departure and was forced to abort takeoff. The FAA has confirmed that it is investigating this incident. American Airlines said in a statement that the aircraft experienced a mechanical issue on takeoff roll, specifically involving a tire. American Airlines also confirmed the Boeing aircraft is undergoing inspection following this incident. Now we go back to our discussion with Thomas Porteous. He's an anchor and correspondent. Thomas, thank you for joining. What more can you tell us about this news?
Yes, thankfully all 173 passengers evacuated from the aircraft safely in Denver earlier today. The medical team, once it was able to board, evaluated 6 passengers as being injured after the incident, one of which was taken to hospital only with a minor injury. The Denver Fire Department and airport firefighting units responded immediately to the malfunction and accident, extinguishing the fire at around 5:10 local time. So as we so far know, the situation has been handled, it is safe, and there is no need for further alarm in regards to this situation.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for sharing that. That's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.